Spiritual effort has an end, and you are reaching it. Not the end as in giving up, not the end as in arriving at a destination where everything is resolved and nothing will challenge you anymore. The end of spiritual effort as a mode of operation, the point where conscious development stops being something you do and becomes something you are, where the awareness you cultivated stops being a practice and becomes your nature. This is not a promise of enlightenment in the sense of levitating above problems. It is something more functional, more verifiable, and more deeply transformative than any special state that popular spirituality promises as a destination. It is embodiment, the complete integration of what you've understood, not only in the mind, not only in moments of practice, but in the nervous system, in automatic patterns, in reactions that happen before conscious thought has a chance to intervene. The point where what you've learned about awareness stops being something you access when you're attentive and becomes the substrate from which you act even when you're not. You arrived at this video because you are feeling the limit of the effort phase, not the limit as failure, but as the exhaustion of a way of operating that was necessary for a long time and is now asking to be transcended. You worked, practiced, developed genuine understanding of how awareness works, of your own patterns, of the difference between reactivity and chosen response. And still, there is a gap between what you understand and what happens automatically when life applies enough pressure that conscious thought can't catch up before the reaction. This gap is the invitation to the next level. Neuroplasticity reveals something that completely changes how we understand this gap. There is no fundamental difference between a conscious habit and an unconscious habit from the brain's perspective. Both are neural patterns consolidated through repetition. What differentiates them is not the nature of the pattern, but the depth of consolidation. And when a pattern of awareness is consolidated deeply enough, when it has gone through repetition toward integration rather than repetition toward exhaustion, it stops requiring conscious effort to operate. You are not going to learn another spiritual development technique here. You are going to recognize that the phase of techniques is ending, and that what begins now is the phase of integration, which follows a completely different logic. This is the exact moment, not before, because the exhaustion of the effort phase only appears when the effort has been genuine enough to reach its natural limit, and not after, because the gap between understanding and integration closes more easily when you recognize the process for what it is. Leaving before the end would mean missing the piece that transforms conscious effort into embodied nature. Less than 1% of people who have reached your level of development understand that there is a phase after effort, and that this phase follows a logic that effort itself cannot produce, no matter how much is applied. And there is a paradox that will fully reveal itself at the end. The more you strive to integrate what you've learned, the more integration recedes. And when you stop striving in the right way, integration happens with a naturalness that effort never produced. But before understanding what integration asks of you, we need to look at what has always prevented you from entering this phase. The most common behavior of those approaching the limit of the effort phase is to apply more effort. You feel that your development hasn't reached where it should, that the gap between what you understand and what you do automatically is still larger than the time you've invested should have produced. So the logical conclusion is that you need more practice, more consistency, more discipline, more work on the patterns that still resist. And the more you apply this logic, the more the gap remains. Because the gap between understanding and integration is not filled by additional effort at understanding. It is filled by a process of a different nature, one that effort, no matter how well directed, cannot produce. Integration is no longer learning, it is settling. What you've learned needs to descend from the level of understood knowledge to the level of embodied knowledge. And this downward movement does not happen when you are continuously adding new layers of understanding on top. It happens when you stop adding and allow what is already present to fully settle. The counterintuitive inversion is this: the gap between understanding and integration is not filled by more development effort. It is filled by the cessation of development effort, which creates the space for what has been learned to consolidate at the level where it operates automatically. The difference between development through effort and integration through settling is like the difference between continuing to pour water into a glass and stopping so that the sediment can settle at the bottom. The glass doesn't become fuller when you stop pouring. It becomes clearer, because what was suspended finally has the space to settle where it belongs. Quantum coherence, the state in which elements of a system operate in such deep synchronization that a new property emerges beyond any individual element, is not produced by trying to synchronize each element through effort. It emerges when the system is given the space to self-organize. Think of snow settling. While it's falling, it's in motion, without defined form, without stable structure. When it lands, settling begins. And what forms has a structure that motion could never have produced? The integration of awareness works the same way. While you are in constant movement of development, what you've learned remains suspended. When you land, settling transforms what was suspended into structure. But here is what most people stop listening to, and it is exactly what changes everything. The integration of awareness has a specific mechanism that explains why it cannot be forced, and what creates the conditions for it to happen naturally. Spiritual development goes through phases with radically different natures. The first phase is acquisition. You acquire understanding, practices, insights, frameworks that change how you perceive and process experience. The second phase is consolidation. What has been acquired needs to consolidate into neural patterns, stable enough to operate without conscious effort. The third phase is embodiment. What has consolidated begins to operate spontaneously, as nature, without you needing to invoke what you've learned. Most people spend their entire lives in the first phase, continuously acquiring, without ever giving the second phase the space it needs to complete. And the second phase only completes when you stop adding and allow the process of consolidation. Neuroplasticity documents this precisely. Neural patterns consolidate during periods of non-learning, specifically during sleep, during active rest, during moments when the mind is not focused on acquiring new information. The brain does not consolidate during learning. It consolidates in the intervals between learning and when there are not enough intervals. When the mode of development is constant addition, consolidation never has the space to complete. Embodiment, the phase of total integration, is what emerges when consolidation is deep enough for patterns of awareness to operate at a reflexive level, not a reflective one. The difference between these two levels is like the difference between a musician who thinks about chords while playing and a musician who has internalized them so deeply that their hands know them without the mind needing to mediate. Think of a craftsman who has developed their craft to the level of mastery. At the beginning, every gesture was conscious, deliberate, effortful. Over time and with proper repetition, those gestures moved from conscious attention to unconscious competence, and the master craftsman is no longer present in the same way as the apprentice. They are freer, more present to the whole, because what required attention now operates without it. Take a deep breath now. Inhale slowly, exhale completely. Notice, in this moment, if there is any area of your life, any way of being or responding, that has clearly moved beyond conscious effort into naturalness. Something you learned that now simply is, without needing to remember to apply it. That is partial embodiment. What we are talking about is the generalization of that state across all layers of your life. The practical consequence is straightforward. What needs to happen now is no longer learning. It is allowing what has been learned to complete its consolidation process and creating the conditions that this process needs in order to happen. But there is an obstacle that prevents most people from entering the integration phase. And ironically, it is built with the same tools that produced all the development of the effort phase. And when you truly understand this, you realize there is an obstacle no one talks about. What blocks you is not what you think it is. The obstacle is not a lack of depth in the work you've done so far. It is the identity of the practitioner that the work has created. Over years of spiritual development, you have built an identity largely defined by the act of practicing, of working, developing, seeking, progressing. And this identity has a specific trait. It does not know what to do when practice ends. It has no self outside of practice. So when the integration process asks you to stop adding so that settling can occur, this identity interprets the pause as abandonment, as ceasing to be who you are. The central paradox is this: the practitioner identity, which was the vehicle of development, becomes the obstacle to embodiment. Because embodiment is no longer a practice, it is the absence of the need for practice. And the practitioner identity does not know how to exist in that absence. This shows up as the feeling that you should be doing more, that resting from development is spiritual laziness, that if you are not actively working, then you are stagnating, as the difficulty of simply being, without a project of improvement, without a growth agenda, without a practice that justifies your time. Your discomfort with the absence of practice is not your enemy. It is the last guardian before the breakthrough, the practitioner identity, resisting its own transcendence. And this resistance is not negative. It is a sign that the development was genuine enough to create a cohesive identity around practice. The guardian is not wrong to resist. It is simply being loyal to a phase that has already fulfilled its role. The difference between practitioner identity, which needs to practice to exist, and embodied identity, which is the practice without needing to practice it, is like the difference between a musician who needs an instrument to be a musician and a musician who is music, regardless of whether they have an instrument in their hands right now. How do you transcend the practitioner identity without betraying the work it represents? This loop will remain open for another moment, because the answer is not to abandon practice. It is something more subtle and more radical in its implications. If you've made it this far, you are already at the threshold of the integration phase. Recognizing the guardian is already different from being ruled by it. So how do you cross this final guardian? Here is what changes everything. The solution to the practitioner identity that blocks embodiment is not to abandon practice. It is to change your relationship with it, from practice as duty to practice as expression. The practitioner identity practices because it believes that without practice, something will give way. regress, be lost. It is a relationship of practice as maintenance, the effort that sustains what has been built. The embodied identity practices when it does, because practice is an expression of what it is, not a condition for continuing to be. It is the difference between breathing as effort and breathing as nature. The practical instruction is this: in the coming days, experiment with a full day without any formal development practice, no meditation, no journaling, no growth readings, no structured reflection. Just live with the awareness you already have, with what you've already integrated, with what you already are. Observe what happens when you stop sustaining development through effort and allow what has been developed to sustain itself. If what you've developed is real, and it is, it will be there. Not as a practice you remembered to apply, but as a nature that simply operates. Before continuing, pause here. Notice, right now, without doing anything special, without breathing in a technical way, without observing thoughts as a practice, without any intention of development, the quality of your presence in this moment, it is there. The awareness you've developed is operating now, without effort, without active practice. This is the partial embodiment that already exists within you. What is being asked is to recognize it and trust that recognition is enough for it to expand. The loop opened earlier closes here. Transcending the practitioner identity is not abandoning who you were during the years of work. It is honoring what the work produced by trusting that the work was enough for what was being built, and that what was built can sustain itself without you continuing to build it. This resolves the blockage of the practitioner identity, but there is a deeper layer that determines whether the embodiment that emerges from this pause will become permanent or remain a temporary state that the old pattern reclaims when life applies enough pressure. This layer is where what you are experiencing meets millennia of confirmation that the end of effort is not the end of development. It is the beginning of what development was trying to produce. Comment now, I am integrating, not as an affirmation of a process you are forcing, but as a declaration of a process you are recognizing and allowing. The difference between forcing and allowing is everything, and this deeper layer, it is where everything you've learned becomes permanent or disappears within days. You are not discovering something that has never been mapped before. You are arriving, through your own path of years of genuine work, at the same recognition reached by those who came before you, those who went far enough on the path to see what exists beyond effort. Zen Buddhism has a koan that circulates among advanced practitioners. Before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. The same act, the same daily life. What changed was not the activity, but who performs it. And the who, after awakening, is no longer striving to achieve. It is expressing its nature. Chopping wood is no longer practice. It is simply chopping wood with the totality of who one is present in each gesture. The philosopher Abraham Maslow, in his later research on self-actualized individuals, identified something he called meta-motivation, a state in which the human being is no longer motivated by deficiency, seeking to fill what is lacking, but by abundance, expressing what is overflowing. Meta-motivation does not carry the urgency of deficiency-based motivation. It has a different quality, calmer, more sustainable, more integrated into everyday life, and what it produces is more robust and more creative than anything deficiency-based motivation could generate. Sufism, especially in the tradition of Rumi, describes the states of fana, and baka, the dissolution of the separate ego, fana, followed not by emptiness, but by re-emergence in a state of subsistence, baekua, where the being operates from the field instead of striving to reach it. Baka is not continued spiritual effort. It is what remains when effort has completed its work, and what is left is the nature that was always there beneath the effort. And the psychology of flow, developed by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, decades of research into peak performance and fulfillment, shows that flow, the state in which action happens without friction and without separation between doer and doing, is not produced by trying to be in flow. It arises when skill is sufficiently consolidated that the effort of execution disappears, and what remains is pure action. Zen Buddhism, Maslow and metamotivation, Sufism and Baka, flow psychology, all describing the same structure. There is a phase after effort, and what exists in that phase is more complete, more integrated, and more effective than anything effort produced, precisely because effort has done its job and can now rest. The unifying statement is this: the end of spiritual effort is not the end of development. It is the beginning of everything development was trying to produce, the state where what has been learned operates as nature, where what has been practiced happens as expression, where what has been cultivated blossoms without needing to be consciously maintained every day. Bringing this directly to you, the years of work you have done were not in vain. They were building something, and what was built is now asking to be inhabited, not continuously sustained by the effort of building, but simply lived in as the home that the work created. The difference between development as an ongoing project and development as embodied nature is like the difference between the architect who designs and the resident who inhabits what was built. The architect cannot live while designing. The resident does not need to design in order to live. Like a fruit that stops growing, not because it failed, but because it ripened. What you are experiencing is not the end of the process. It is the end of growth and the beginning of maturity. And when you embody this, not as an idea, but as identity, something changes that cannot be undone. You are no longer someone who is in spiritual development. You are someone who has recognized that development has fulfilled its role, and that what begins now is inhabiting what development built, not actively maintaining what was built, inhabiting, expressing, living from what you are instead of the continuous effort of becoming. You already are the integrated awareness. The moment you stop treating integration as another development project to be completed through effort, you will not achieve embodiment when practice produces consistent enough results to prove that it is working. You will not arrive at total integration when no old pattern ever appears again. You are already integration in process, and the process of integration no longer asks for effort. It asks for trust in what effort has produced. We are those who choose to inhabit what has been built instead of continuing to build out of fear that it will stop being real when effort stops. Who choose expression over practice, nature over project, the resident over the architect in permanent construction. Who know, not as a belief waiting for confirmation, but as recognition of a state already present, that spiritual effort has an end, and that this end is not failure, it is maturity. Do not subscribe to the channel. Subscribe to this frequency of integration, the frequency of those who stopped building and started inhabiting. You who have made it this far are no longer someone applying effort to develop. You are someone who has recognized that development is asking to become nature, and that the response to that request is no longer effort. It is permission. It is trust. It is the radical act of stopping the support of what already sustains itself. The synthesis is paradoxical. Like every truth worth the cost of finding it, you have not reached the end of the spiritual path. You have reached the end of the spiritual path as effort, and what begins now is the spiritual path as life, not as a practice separate from life, but as the very texture of life itself. In every gesture, every relationship, every moment of stillness and action, comment the word integration below, not as a goal to be achieved, but as recognition of a process that is already happening, and that this video has helped anchor once and for all. You have recognized the end of the effort phase. You have learned the difference between sustaining development and inhabiting what development has produced. But there is a layer beyond internal integration, the layer where what's integrated begins to express itself in the world in ways that effort could never generate. In the next video, I will show why most people who reach embodiment still act from effort instead of from nature, and what specifically changes when action emerges from the integrated being rather than from the being in construction. What you are is already enough. It always has been.